I have a question. What if we've been wasting our time talking to feminists? What if feminism is a convenient vehicle stuffed with talking heads, a movement whose importance has been inflated way beyond its own merits? And what if socialism has been captured in the same way? Both movements providing an army of foot soldiers trained for tasks they don't even themselves understand. It's with this question in mind that I ask your patience while I tell a story about population panic. You see, the period of second-wave feminism spanned the 1960s and 70s, which is the same period that population reduction had been adopted as a national security priority for the United States. When I say population panic, I mean the widespread fear fueled by the media that the world population was growing and people would soon start fighting over food. The answer to this perceived problem, according to powerful people, was to find ways to stop people having babies. In China, the government introduced the one-child policy, but America found a willing army of activists ready to persuade rather than compel families to have less children. And what more convenient army could there have been than the ideologues of feminism? So this story offers an alternative explanation for the success of feminism as we know it today. Probably the best place to start is to introduce you to a document known as the Jaffa memo. This memo was written in 1969 by Frederick S. Jaffa, who was at that time Technical Director of Planned Parenthood. The memo was addressed to Bernard Berelson, who was the president of a lesser-known but equally important organization called the Population Council. Both of these organizations, as a matter of non-coincidence, were funded to a large extent by the Rockefeller Foundation. The most interesting part of the memo for our purposes is an attached table that lists specific suggestions, but first the historical context will convey the importance of the document. As a disclaimer, sort of, but not, I must point out that the Rockefeller Archive has inserted this statement in new ink on an old document. Quote, Jaffa was merely cataloguing various proposals for population control advocated by others, not Planned Parenthood, which is clear in this original memo, end quote. So they say, but without mentioning who those others were. However, another employee of Planned Parenthood lets the cat out of the bag, because Robin Elliott, who was coordinator of population activities at Planned Parenthood, states the following, quote, the report was prepared in behalf of Planned Parenthood's Population Education Staff Committee as a basis for discussion of and action on the U.S. population problem by the Planned Parenthood National Organization, end quote. So this was not just random thoughts or a pet project produced in isolation by Jaffa. Although Elliott clears up one point, he increases the concern about another, because the subject line of the Jaffa memo refers to population policy, but the Rockefeller Archive uses the term population control, while Elliott himself uses the term population problem. So the protestations of the Rockefeller Archive sound like one of those move along, nothing to see here situations with which we've become so familiar in recent times. In any case, when Berelson passed away in the year 1979, the Washington Post wrote an obituary for him which stated, quote, in the late 1960s, he became one of the first to research ways of dealing with population problems beyond the family planning stage, end quote. But Jaffa's memo reveals that Berelson's research included exploration of, quote, the uses and limits of voluntary action in solving the population problem, end quote. So no matter whether some of the statements that appear in Jaffa's memo appear as hypothetical and suggestive, the intention is clear, meaning that population is a problem, it needs a solution, and if voluntary action fails, then government action will be required to mandate a solution. Jaffa also states, quote, the debate thus far has not seriously grappled with the predictable political consequences of a major effort to adopt and enforce an antinatalist U.S. population policy, end quote. Bear in mind that Jaffa's memo was written in the year 1969, so the antinatalist policy he discusses precedes the Chinese one-child policy, which was introduced 10 years later in 1979. This idea of an antinatalist policy comes from the population alarmists of the day. They were, still are in fact, followers of a Malthusian view of population control committed to a target of net zero, if not population decline. The followers of Malthus were not, however, the only ideologues huddled under the population utopia umbrella, because the advocates of eugenics, who were also active in this debate, were less interested in the theories of Malthus and much more interested in the theories of Darwin, meaning the theory of natural selection and the survival of the fittest and the purest, which explains why Jaffa writes, quote, "An indoctrination campaign may well have only negligible effects on fertility values, but may provide unintended support in building public opinion which seeks legalized compulsory fertility control for selected groups, particularly welfare recipients." End quote. And just to dispel any naive impression that Jaffa and his crew only had it in for the workless, he also writes, quote, "The arguments advanced to justify an explicit US policy now of encouraging a specific universal limit on family size, as distinct from proposals aimed selectively at welfare recipients and racial groups, center mainly on two propositions." End quote. Or to put it another way, you have a choice. It's either going to be a one-child policy or a eugenics policy. Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and Marie Stopes, who was the founder of its British counterpart, both have a documented history of statements showing they had at least one foot in the eugenics camp. Indeed, as recently as 2020, an article in The Independent revealed that, quote, "Marie Stopes International has distanced itself from the key figure in the history of family planning to become MSI Reproductive Choices." The charity said her legacy has become deeply entangled with her views on eugenics, and the name change signalled it did not adhere to or condone these beliefs, end quote. Given that they kept MSI in the new name, one could be forgiven for thinking that their idea of distance seemed to be little more than the length of a sentence. In any case, leaving aside the debate, it is clear that the population zero advocates were intermingled in common cause with the eugenicists and the feminists, and even the socialists. Eventually, one side would gain the upper hand in the argument, but I'll explain that later. First, though, let's consider a different question. Not what was Jaffa thinking, but rather what was Berelson thinking, because it was Berelson, acting on behalf of the Population Council, who started the ball rolling. And it becomes obvious the more one scratches the surface that Berelson was preparing for something that he, and certainly Jaffa and Rockefeller too, knew was soon to happen. You see, many of these people and organizations saw it as their duty to lobby the government, partly to win government agencies over to the narratives of population control, and partly to win funding from those agencies for their own activities. And those lobbying efforts were about to pay the ultimate dividend, because the Jaffa memo was dated in March of 1969, and just 4 months later, in July of 1969, President Richard Nixon would announce the establishment of the Commission on Population Growth and the American Future. Nixon stated at the time, quote, "One of the most serious challenges to human destiny in the last third of this century will be the growth of the population," end quote. So Berelson was already gathering ideas and people in preparation for his big opportunity, and it should come as no surprise to learn that the person appointed to be chairman of this commission was John D. Rockefeller himself. The commission also included Berelson, who I've already mentioned, and David E. Bell, executive vice president of the Ford Foundation. Jaffa himself did not make it onto the board of the commission, but he was enlisted by the commission as a staff consultant. Considering the amount of thinking and talking that had preceded the establishment of the Commission, it might also be surprising to note that it took almost 3 years before it submitted its report in March of 1972, and for a while it appeared as if the issue had reached its zenith. But even though there were some criticisms of the report as being somewhat bland, it had in fact set off an avalanche, because it provided Nixon with the justification to request another report, this time from none other a political figure than Henry Kissinger. At the time of this order from Nixon, Kissinger was serving both as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to the President. So the extraordinary significance of this move was to elevate the subject of worldwide population growth to a matter of national security for the United States. A memo issued 2 years after the Rockefeller report stated, quote, The President has directed a study of the impact of world population growth on U.S. security and overseas interests, end quote. This memo was issued from the National Security Council and addressed to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Deputy Secretary of State, and the Administrator of the Agency for International Development, known as USAID. By the time the study, titled National Security Study Memo 200, was completed, Nixon had already left office, but his replacement, Gerald Ford, wasted no time approving it with National Security Decision Memo 314. This decision memo also indicated a shift in the scope of thinking behind the agencies who wrote the NSSM 200 report, because for the first time, the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare of the United States appears among the addressees. In other words, the capabilities and resources of some of the most powerful agencies in the United States government were now being tasked to study and develop funding programs for population control both at home and abroad, and the level of priority given to their work was to be an issue of national security for the United States. Having a population strategy at home would have been controversial enough, but the Kissinger report talks about something it calls, quote, a U.S. global population strategy, end quote. This would obviously be concerning for the governments of developing countries, which might explain why the report was classified as secret and not declassified until years later. This population strategy is stated in the report, where one chapter is titled, quote, Action to Create Conditions for Fertility Decline, end quote. And there are other references to creating, quote, a climate for fertility decline, end quote, and, quote, conditions conducive to fertility decline, end quote. The report also states, quote, the proposed strategy calls for a coordinated approach to respond to the important U.S. foreign policy interest in the influence of population growth on the world's political, economic, and ecological systems. The major impact of the benefits will be felt less by those of us in the U.S. and other countries today than by our children and grandchildren, end quote. Of course, throughout the drafting of the Kissinger report, the prior work of Berlson, Jaffa and Rockefeller had not been forgotten. Indeed, aside from the fingerprints they left on the ideas, the report specifically states that the U.S. Agency for International Development already had a close working relationship with them. Quote, with assistance from AID, a number of private family planning organizations, that is, Pathfinder Fund, International Planned Parenthood Foundation, and the Population Council have significantly expanded their worldwide population programs. Such organizations are still the main supporters of family planning action in many developing countries, end quote. I have already mentioned Planned Parenthood and the Population Council, but Pathfinder also deserves a mention. The Wikipedia entry for Pathfinder as of April 2024 includes the following, quote, its family planning work began in the late 1920s when its founder, Clarence Gamble, heir of the Procter & Gamble soap company fortune, supported efforts to introduce contraception to women and couples in the United States and 60 other countries. In addition to his eugenicist work, he worked towards easy access to contraception in minority communities, end quote. In fact, speaking in 2021 on the subject of eugenics, Ford Foundation President Darren Walker stated that, quote, all of the great names of legacy philanthropy are implicated in this movement, end quote. In spite of that hidden undercurrent, though, the population control movement was only got its breakout moment in 1968 when Paul Ehrlich wrote a book titled The Population Bomb. Ehrlich admitted years later that he was requested to write a book in a hurry in the hope that it might influence the 1968 presidential election, which Nixon won. Ehrlich uses the word naively in his account, which makes one suspect he might not have been happy with the election outcome. In any case, Charles Mann, writing for the Smithsonian magazine in 2018, states that Ehrlich's book, quote, gave a huge jolt to the nascent environmental movement and fueled an anti-population growth crusade that led to human rights abuses around the world, end quote. Some of those abuses are described by author Betsy Hartman in her 1987 book Reproductive Rights and Wrongs. Charles Mann continues, quote, "In Egypt, Tunisia, Pakistan, South Korea, and Taiwan, health workers' salaries were, in a system that invited abuse, dictated by the number of IUDs they inserted into women. In the Philippines, birth control pills were literally pitched out of helicopters hovering over remote villages. Millions of people were sterilized, often coercively, sometimes illegally, frequently in unsafe conditions, in Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. In the 1970s and 80s, India, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and her son Sanjay, embraced policies that in many states required sterilization for men and women to obtain water, electricity, ration cards, medical care, and pay raises. Teachers could also expel students from school if their parents weren't sterilized." End quote. Meanwhile, Ehrlich was making the rounds of late-night talk shows and appeared on the Johnny Carson show many times during this period, and needless to say, more than 50 years later, none of his doomsday prophecies have come true. In spite of the appearance that Ehrlich's book was a runaway popular success based all on its own merits, the fact is that the richest people in the world had got it into their heads at that time that there was a problem with population, and that the problem with population was that there was too much of it. So who better to preach that there are too many of them than a man who studied insects, which was Ehrlich's day job. He was a professor of entomology at Stanford University. By coincidence, it was another entomologist, Alfred Kinsey, who in 1948 wrote a runaway hit titled Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. His success was also due in no small part to long-term direct funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. So as they say in the theatre, the stage was set. There were earlier players, but for the purposes of talking about modern cultural change, we can start with Ehrlich. His book was released in 1968. Jaffa's memo was written in March of 1969, and the Rockefeller Commission was appointed in July of that same year. The Rockefeller Commission published its report in 1972, and 2 years later, in 1974, Nixon tasked Kissinger with the problem of population. It took Kissinger only 1 year to publish his report, which was then authorized by Gerald Ford in 1975. From that point forward, the issue of population control was on the United States national security table. Indeed, it was on every table. Speaking of India's program of compelled sterilization, World Bank President Robert McNamara stated, quote, "At long last, India is moving to effectively address its population problem." End quote. And having set the scene, we can now go back and take a closer look at Jaffa's memo. Jaffa arranged his suggestions in table format and included the table as an attachment to the body of his memo. I'll display the table here, but some things are not in an order that helps with the continuity of argument, so I will read and comment from a list that is arranged for that purpose. Also, some of the items on the list deserve longer discussion that would interrupt the picture created by the memo, so I'll skip over those topics and return to them later. The title of the table is Proposed Measures to Reduce Fertility by Universality or Selectivity of Impact in the US. It begins with the idea to restructure the family by A. Postponing or avoiding marriage, and B. Alter the image of the ideal family size. There's little doubt that both these ideas would have some effect on the fertility of a family, but it's debatable whether either of them would alter the structure of the family. In reality, though, nothing could be more disruptive to the structure of the family than for the mother to be sent out to work, which is what the memo suggests elsewhere. So we can also include here those items about working mothers, and they are 1. Encourage women to work, or, much more devious, require women to work and provide few childcare facilities. The next item on the list is about the compulsory education of children. This sounds innocent enough, in fact we could even say laudable, but the fly in the ointment only becomes visible when we ask, what will we educate the children about? And the answer is provided, in part at least, by the next item in the list, which is encourage increased homosexuality. After that, the next item is educate for family limitation. Of course, it's a tricky thing to tell a group of children that there are too many of them and that their parents were careless, so maybe that's why we hear young people today claiming that they don't want to have children because it's bad for the environment. Next on the list is an idea coming straight out of the population net zero mentality, which is put fertility control agents in the water supply. This might seem like an impossible feat of engineering that would come with great political risks, but those risks would only apply if the intention was to deliberately put or add fertility control agents to the water, and most especially if such fertility inhibitors only affected females. But what would we expect to happen if fertility inhibitors appeared by accident or oversight in the food chain, and if those inhibitors only affect the fertility of males? Then, based on what we already know about public opinion and public concern for the well-being of men, we could expect the reaction to be muted, which is indeed exactly what we've got. Dr. Shanna Swan and her colleagues wrote a paper in 2017 which described over the previous 50 years male sperm counts had declined by 1% per year. In an updated paper in 2022, her group published the conclusions of a more extensive study which states, quote, "Data suggest that this worldwide decline is continuing in the 21st century at an accelerated pace. Research on the causes of this continuing decline and actions to prevent further disruption of male reproductive health are urgently needed." End quote. But of course, this information and the appeals from the scientists who conducted the research have been met with a dumb silence. So now let's move on to category 2. Which is selective impact depending on socioeconomic status. The items listed here are to modify tax policies by creating a substantial tax on marriage, or a child tax, or a tax on married people more than single people, removing parents' tax exemption, or creating additional taxes on parents with more than 1 or 2 children in school. After taxes, we come to the welfare benefits that could be modified, and they are reduce or eliminate paid maternity leave or benefits, reduce or eliminate children's or family allowances, provide bonuses for delayed marriage and greater child spacing, offer pensions for women at 45 years with less than N children, whatever N would be, eliminate welfare payments after the first 2 children, require women to work and provide few child care facilities. We mentioned that already. Limit or eliminate public financed medical care, scholarships, housing, loans and subsidies to families with more than, again, N children. So that's a pretty thorough package of measures. If we describe all of this last set of measures together, that is, the increase in taxes and the loss of social welfare benefits, we would have to say they're measures for poor people, meaning middle and working class or unemployed, because they would make having a child something of a luxury, akin to buying an expensive car. After all, rich people can easily afford the extra expense, and besides, they do frequently change their domicile to avoid taxes, so they would not need to worry about this package of measures in the same way as others less fortunate than themselves. But there is one thing that I did not yet mention, which was included in this part of the list, and that is chronic depression. It's interesting to note that those who contributed to the drafting of Jaffa's memo in 1969 already knew that people who were depressed were less likely to have children. But it is equally interesting to note that they included this proposal with a package of seemingly unrelated measures that were tailored for poor people. In any case, leaving aside the eugenicist undertones of the memo, the Harvard Health blog reported that from 1988 to 2008, the increase in antidepressant use in the United States had reached 400%. And some reports estimate that there has been another 60% increase in the post-COVID period. Now, under the same general heading of selective impact depending on socioeconomic status, there was a list of loopholes, and by that I mean measures that could be negotiable based on how much you can pay and perhaps whom you're willing to pay. Those items are A. Compulsory abortion of out-of-wedlock pregnancies, B. Compulsory sterilization of all who have 2 children except for a few who would be allowed 3, C. Confined childbearing to only a limited number of adults, D. Stock certificate type permits for children, and E. Housing policies, 1 being discouragement of private home ownership, and 2. Stop awarding public housing based on family size. The issue of discouraging private home ownership is something that would be difficult to accomplish with legislation. However, it would be not at all difficult to accomplish with inflation. So, as the World Economic Forum saying goes, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And the final section of the Jaffa memo is titled Measures Predicated on Existing Motivation to Prevent Unwanted Pregnancy. And they are 1. Payments to encourage sterilization, 2. Payments to encourage contraception, payments to encourage abortion and sterilization on demand, that's right, not safe and rare, but on demand. 5. Allow harmless contraceptives to be distributed non-medically. 6. Improve contraceptive technology. 7. Make contraception truly available and accessible. 8. Improve maternal health care with family planning a core element. And just to remind us that the money is never far away, it is worth noting here that this last set of measures, if they were implemented, would have resulted in direct financial gains for the Planned Parenthood business model. Now let me return to 2 items I skipped over. With reference to women going out to work, Jaffa uses the words encourage and require. Elsewhere in the memo, he uses the term encourage or compel, and he uses it to go far beyond the issue of women choosing work over children. He writes, quote, an explicit U.S. policy to encourage or compel smaller family size in the U.S. is necessary to enable our government effectively to encourage or compel developing nations to move in similar directions, end quote. Jaffa admits that this argument, quote, is not likely to become the primary basis for a U.S. population policy, end quote. Not that he and his friends did not wish to encourage or compel behavior at home in the United States, but they didn't think they could justify their strategy only on the basis that it would influence behavior in other countries. Anyway, Jaffa was wrong about this, because the National Security Council would later say to Jaffa, hold my beer. Or more accurately, they would instruct the United States agencies addressed in memo NSDM-314 thus, quote, domestic efforts in this field must continue in order to achieve worldwide recognition that the United States birth rate is below the replacement level of fertility, end quote. Elsewhere, Jaffa discusses this grey area in terms of going beyond voluntary norms. He writes, quote, the achievement of a society in which effective contraception is effectively distributed to all based on present voluntary norms would either result in a tolerable rate of growth or go very far toward achieving it. If this hypothesis is basically confirmed, it would negate the need for an explicit U.S. population policy which goes beyond voluntary norms, end quote. The second item that needs more discussion is the issue of educating children, and the question we have to ask is what will that education contain? But the answer we can expect to receive to that question is a barrage of silence or outright lies. I offer as evidence for this statement the demonization of parents as domestic terrorists when they had the temerity to attend school board meetings to ask questions or protest policies which were only revealed to them as a result of their children being educated online during school lockdowns. Then there has also been the carnival of absurdly costumed drag queens performing at school events for the education of ogling children who have no idea they're being groomed for a purpose far beyond their comprehension. And that is not even to mention the explicitly sexual books that have been found by inquisitive parents in children's school libraries in many countries. For parents and listeners who are interested in knowing more about this, I must recommend the investigative journalism of Belinda Brown, who has written articles on the topic and who I believe will also present a video on the subject in this same series. Considering the overall antenatal and anti-family themes of Jaffa's memo, one might have expected to see prostitution being included with the same zeal as homosexuality or chronic depression. But prostitution places a market value on sex that is always less than the value women obtain from sex in so-called meaningful relationships. Therefore, feminists who are actually against meaningful relationships are also against prostitution. So no surprise then that the oldest of professions got no mention in Jaffa's memo. There's one other thing that did not appear in Jaffa's memo, but it is also relevant to what he calls the restructuring of the family, and that is the denigration of men. If we're asked to accept that there are such things as voluntary norms, then we have every right to declare that there are also such things as cultural norms, and the cultural norm that is arguably more prominent than any other in this context is the habitual undermining and demonization of men. This trend has undesirable effects that are every bit as influential on the family as any other, because after all, men are fathers to their children and partners to the mothers of those children. All three give something to each other and receive something from each other. But when it becomes an accepted cultural norm to denigrate one member of that trinity, the balance on which it depends is lost. The problem is that families cannot be resilient in that environment, and the motivation to establish a family in the first place becomes difficult to find. Overall then, there's hardly any need to point out that in spite of the fact that some of Jaffa's suggestions were never implemented, the fact is they didn't all need to be. Jaffa and his collaborators wanted to see a decline in fertility. For that to happen, they only needed to succeed with one or several suggestions, and they certainly got that. Restructuring of the family? Check. Compulsory education of children? Check. Encourage increased homosexuality? Check. Encourage women to work? Check. Fertility control agents in the food chain? Check. Abortion on demand? Check. Chronic depression? Check. Decline in the fertility rate of American families? Check. In fact, the underlying motive of the whole effort is brought under a cloud of suspicion by Jaffa's own admission in his memo that, quote, in the long run, a zero rate of population growth is inevitable, end quote. In which case, we're entitled to ask, what was all the fuss about? At this stage now, I think it becomes necessary to lay out some questions that deserve answers, and they are, 1. Did the controlling elite ever have the capability to execute a plan so vast as population control? 2. Might the idea of population control have just been a fad that blew over? And 3. How does the ambition of population control by an oligarchic elite relate to feminism? So let's first address the question of capability. In 1922, Walter Lippmann talked about the manufacture of consent. He was not, of course, talking about the kind of informed consent that we require in law for matters to do with sex, but a passive kind of consent that has more to do with helplessness and resignation than informed choice. The kind of consent that politicians take as a mandate to do whatever pleases them, even when they're really going against the wishes and best interests of the people who elect them. Later in that same decade, a partner in the then powerful Lehman Brothers Bank wrote about the need to create desire in the minds of consumers, meaning all of us. And most recently, during the COVID pandemic, it was revealed how government officials casually talked about the manufacture of fear in order to achieve compliance. Fear is perhaps one of the most dangerous forms of mass manipulation because it is not easy to convert anger into fear, but it is very easy to convert fear into anger. So this is the kind of manipulation that can be used to start wars. Wars that lead to the deaths of many innocent people, not just wars abroad, but also wars at home, like culture wars, which is why we should be willing to treat the manufacture of fear as a public health concern and react to it accordingly. In any case, when we put these three things together, what we get is the algebra of mass manipulation. The manufacture of consent makes people ignorant. The manufacture of desire makes people addicted and indebted. And the manufacture of fear is not just a way to herd the masses, it is also the fuel that precedes the consuming fires of conflict. This formula of mass manipulation describes the qualifications and work history of our capital elite and of the people who govern us. Therefore, it's reasonable to think that the project of controlling and reducing whole populations of people is well within their abilities to carry out, which is why we need to treat the contents of the Jaffa memo seriously. The second question is whether population control might have been a fad of the idle rich, something that blew over after the 1960s Summer of Love, but that's not the case. Indeed, as recently as 2009, a meeting was convened between a group of people who gave themselves the silly Boy Scout name of the Gut Club. This meeting was convened by Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and David Rockefeller, and the attendees included George Soros, Ted Turner, and Michael Bloomberg. News outlets like the Times of London revealed that attendees, quote, spent 15 minutes each outlining their proposals for an umbrella philanthropic cause that they could collectively prioritize. Gates' presentation impressed the other club members greatly, and taking their cues from him, they agreed to prioritize the goal that Gates now urged upon them, overpopulation, end quote. Nor should this suggestion be taken as a one-off idea, because Gates had also stated at a conference in California in the previous year that, quote, the world's population should be capped at 8.3 billion people, end quote. So we can take it from our famously altruistic thought leader that the concern of the oligarchs for the abundance of people on the face of the planet has not gone away. And the third question is, how does the enterprise of population control relate to feminism? The answers to this question come first from the commonality in the objectives of both movements. Returning again to the Jaffa memo, we can see these objectives stated explicitly, namely the restructuring of the family and a decline in fertility. Also, there's no denying that the Rockefeller family, who were the leaders among their peers in the population control movement, were well aware of the potential of feminism to help them advance their cause. Indeed, the popular author and filmmaker Aaron Russo stated in the final interview of his life that Nicholas Rockefeller derided him for thinking that feminism was about women's rights. He then boasted it was the Rockefeller family that promoted feminism in order to get women into the workplace for the dual purpose of increasing the taxable labor force and increasing state control over the education of children. Rockefeller apparently didn't mention the fact that creating a surge of women in the workforce would also create the conditions for population decline and suppress any tendency for a rise in wage costs. The author Seamus Bruner writes in his book The Controligarchs that, quote, starting around 1910, Rockefeller Jr. gave more than $6 million, at least $150 million in today's money, to eugenics organizations such as the Eugenics Records Office, the Bureau of Social Hygiene, and the American Eugenics Society. By 1924, he saw potential in a pro-eugenics feminist who would transform the public view of eugenics from a social necessity to a charitable good, and that was Margaret Sanger, end quote. Actually, Sanger, in the early stages of her career, considered herself to be a socialist rather than a feminist. In her book, The Pivot of Civilization, she describes the origins of her socialistic zeal thus, quote, I threw the weight of my study and activity into the economic and industrial struggle. Here I discovered men and women fired with the glorious vision of a new world, of a proletarian world emancipated, a utopian world, end quote. But it is ironically in her later criticisms of that same doctrine where she exposes the lack of originality in her feminism when she criticizes socialism thus, quote, it's a flattering doctrine, since it teaches the laborer that all the fault is with someone else, that he is the victim of circumstances and not even a partner in the creation of his own child's misery, end quote. Which just goes to show that you can take the feminist out of socialism, but you can't take the socialism out of the feminist. Considering that feminism condones hypergamy and tacitly endorses the idea that women have in fact evolved to be superior to men, there's nothing at all unnatural about a woman being described as a pro-eugenics feminist. But given that eugenics is a doctrine devised by the intellectual elite to the disadvantage, most especially of the lower classes, there would be something deeply hypocritical in the description of a pro-eugenics socialist. And yet that is what Sanger appears to have been, a pro-eugenics socialist identifying as a feminist. Rockefeller Jr.'s top advisor, Raymond Fosdick, justified the family's generosity to Sanger's causes thus, quote, population constitutes one of the great perils of the future, end quote. No doubt in the beginning, feminists were thrilled only to take the money. But as goes the way of these things, feminists would do the work of the Rockefellers and the Rockefellers would do the work of the feminists, meaning the one would help change the public view of population control and the other would help change the public view of feminism. So the relationship between feminism and a capital elite obsessed with population control moved beyond that of puppeteer and painted dolls. Furthermore, let me now recall that formula for mass manipulation that I mentioned earlier, which is the manufacture of consent, the manufacture of desire, and the manufacture of fear. When viewed from another perspective, this formula describes the exercise of power. But powerful elites are not the only ones using it, because feminism has capitalized on the power wielded by women with the same formula. First, because feminism manufactures consent by presenting women as victims, which means that both individually and collectively we become willing to consent to anything they ask. Second, feminism manufactures desire by condoning the existence of a vast industry dedicated solely to the beautification and flagrant sexualization of women, even to the extent of promoting the stars of this enterprise as role models for young women. Of course, random feminists make occasional symbolic protests on this point, but nothing that might dissuade hordes of women from the casual objectification of the very thing that they claim defines them. And third, feminism manufactures fear by inventing and exaggerating ideas like trigger warnings, safe spaces, hate speech, and rape culture, as well as fueling the demonization of men on the most fragile of pretexts. So the sad reality is that our authoritarian elite and our feminist authoritarians are fused together by their sense of superiority and entitlement, and they have mutually agreed that their future prosperity and security is assured so long as they stick together. But there is a sense of alarm spreading among our authoritarians. Why? Because they introduced social changes designed to suppress fertility, and now they're unable to shut off those changes. Dr. Anthony Horvath maintains a website which tracks the Kissinger report, and he writes, quote, "Most people, after reading the final report for themselves, are horrified to learn what the elites were prepared to do and in fact may still be doing to their fellow man. At the time of this writing, there is no documentary evidence publicly available that suggests that the policies Gerald Ford directed the US to implement vis-a-vis NSSM 200 have ceased to be the official position of the United States of America. If anyone has such evidence, this site would be pleased to reflect it." End quote. The problem for our authoritarian elites is therefore that they have overshot the mark and created a completely different kind of national security threat from the one they predicted. This is a threat that our governments are trying to forestall by allowing a surge in immigration. But just as the mechanisms designed to suppress fertility were clandestine, the mechanisms designed to remedy the problem they created must also be clandestine. In other words, they can't admit what they did. So the surge in immigration being experienced by developed countries has to be justified on humanitarian grounds, and the people who question the wisdom of such policies have to be smeared as racists. Meanwhile, population decline has become probably the most consequential crisis facing humanity today, and is still as yet a barely acknowledged horizon event. It is, however, both frustrating and amusing to listen to the experts trying to explain the causes of this crisis without ever mentioning the obvious. The fact is that since the 1970s, powerful agencies with almost limitless resources were instructed by their governments to quietly discourage women from having babies and to quietly discourage girls from becoming the kind of women who might want babies. This program has been very successful. But the governments concerned cannot admit that it was largely their doing, nor can they admit that they cultivated a relationship with feminism to aid them in their purpose. In fact, going back further in time, by the 1920s, the advertising industry had already woken up to the enormous potential of feminism to help them influence the behavior of women. After all, that was the essence of their business model, to change the behavior of people. And it was the collective mass of women who proved most attractive to them, in part because women wielded great influence over household spending, and in part because women proved more susceptible than men to the sly, suggestive language of advertisers. One of the earliest and best-known examples of this was when Edward Bernays used the words "torches of freedom" to describe the cigarettes that his models smoked during a public parade. The idea behind these words was, of course, borrowed directly from the feminist thinking of the day. By the time the Kissinger report began to wield its influence in the 1970s, the advertising industry had also recognized that men were an obstacle in the way of its influence over women, and therefore of household spending. Their solution to that problem was to diminish the influence and authority of men and cajole women to work outside the home. This advertising and media strategy has persisted in our culture till present times to an extent that the display of contempt for and mistrust of men has been normalized, therefore making men unacceptable to women as partners in life and fathers to the children they would have liked to bear. Meanwhile, the CIA, which was one of the agencies deputized with creating the conditions for fertility decline, had already shifted the attention of their glamorous operative Gloria Steinem from that of a radical socialist counter-revolutionary working in Europe to a radical feminist working at home. When we take account of these factors and others besides, we can say that partly by coincidence, but mostly by design, a perfect storm was forming which would place every whim of feminism at the centre of government administration and policy making. The practical effect of this strategy was to reduce the numbers of children being born, but the delayed effect was and is to reduce the existential power of children, that power being the unifying power that binds a society together. Without this binding and aspirational influence, we only have ideas to hold us together, but ideas are not enough. In conclusion, I would like to point out that much of the work that I described in this talk has been carried out under the umbrella of philanthropy, which explains in part why we are so passive, even welcoming in our reactions to it. But Mr. Peter Flaherty, who is CEO of the National Legal and Policy Council, caused a sensation in 2023 by announcing at the annual general meeting of the Berkshire Hathaway Group that, quote, "if woke is the disease, then philanthropy is the virus," end quote. On reflection, however, I would say that Mr. Flaherty has understated the case. The fact is that our most prominent philanthropists have been at the forefront of the long campaign to mould government policy and public behaviour on the issue of women having babies. But they themselves are immune to words of caution because they tend to see themselves in a divine light. One of the oldest, J.D. Rockefeller, explained how God deputized him thus, quote, "I believe the power to make money is a gift from God, and having been endowed with the gift I possess, I believe it is my duty to make money, and still more money, and to use the money I make for the good of my fellow man, according to the dictates of my conscience," end quote. This coming from a man who destroyed the lives of competitors, hired thugs to shoot strikers, and then miraculously salvaged his reputation by converting to philanthropy. A philanthropy that was then and still is inclined to support behaviours that will deter any increase in the number of children. But Rockefeller was no mere outdated relic isolated in a peculiar time, because the tendency of monopolists who start thinking about what's best for the people is to see themselves as superior to the people they say they're trying to help. In the words of George Soros, quote, "I fancied myself as some kind of god. If truth be known, I carried some rather potent messianic fantasies with me from childhood which I felt I had to control. It is a sort of disease when you consider yourself some kind of god, the creator of everything. But I feel comfortable about it now since I began to live it out," end quote. Which now brings me back to my first question. Are we wasting our time talking to feminists? If the things I've said here are even partly true, surely they might at least cause us to change what we say when we do talk to feminists. And with that, if you made it this far, know your enemy and thanks for your time.